welcome aboard the Giddy Carousel of Pop, a podcast all about the tip-top pop mag smash hits. And what we do is take an old issue, usually from the 80s, although we may slide a year or two either side of that, and have a good poke around its pages with a guest who could be a pop kid, someone who worked on the mag, and with any luck, maybe even a pop star who appeared on its pages. I'm still working on that one. I'm Simon Galloway, and with me, as ever, is our very own Ruddy Big Pig, is Mr. Gavin Hogg.
What an introduction. Thanks, Si.
It's all right.
I'm honoured. I really am honoured. Should I just explain that for anyone that's new to the Giddy Carousel of Pop and the strange world of smash hits?
Yes, please do.
Rick Astley, before he was famous, wrote a song called Ruddy Big Pig, which kind of went down in smash hits legend. And then when I rediscovered it when we were doing this podcast, I've sort of become slightly obsessed by it. So much so that Kath Sked, who was on the last episode of the podcast, sent off for one of those T-shirts, you know, when you can make your own, with a great big cartoon pig on it and Ruddy Big Pig underneath. And I've taken to wearing it and tweeting Rick Astley. I'm trying to get a re-recording. You know, there's bound to be a Rick Astley box set coming out soon. It needs the unreleased version of Ruddy Big Pig, surely.
There's got to be. We've got to have that in the world.
There's got to be more people who want to hear that. Anyway, yeah, so that's why I'm the Ruddy Big Pig. Thanks, Si.
It's all right, anytime. So we've got a few shout-outs and mentions before we get stuck into the chat today.
Yeah, let's do it. I tweeted yesterday just to say that we were going to be recording this one today, and we had quite a few likes. Adrian Specs, hello to you, Adrian. Mark Taylor, How Michael, Timmy Ward, Chris McGrail, Pete Brasted, Pop Rambler, and the aforementioned Kath Sked all got in touch on Twitter and liked our tweet. So hello to all of you. Thank you very much. You got any mentions on the Facebook, Si?
Yeah, got a few Facebook mentions. Can I just say, Chris McGrail, whenever I talk about Chris on the podcast, that's the Chris I'm talking about.
Oh, that's the Chris?
That's the Chris. So, hi, Chris. Thanks for getting in touch. Thanks for listening.
Hey up, Chris.
Yes, a few people got in touch on Facebook. Sarah Jane Bradshaw, Ian Duff, Jerry Cassidy, Jared Hopkinson, Steve Fenton, and our old buddy Tim Robinson, who was our guest on the first episode of the podcast. Hey. So, hello to you lot. Thanks for paying attention. You know, it's very nice that you've done that. Well, we're not on our own, as ever. We do have a guest with us, and it's time to welcome them onto the carousel. For the last 10 years, he's been the CEO of the Professional Publishers Association, travelling the world and banging the drum for the magazine industry. And before that, he was involved in a string of highly successful mags, including being the launch editor for Empire way back in 1989. And before even that, he was editor of Smash Hits from October 1986 to January 1989, during which time the magazine achieved its highest ever circulation figures. It's our great pleasure to welcome aboard the Giddy Carousel of Pop, Barry McIlheney.
That guy sounds really good, actually. I like the sound of him.
He sounds like a high flyer.
He sounds like a high-flying, impressive media type. Good afternoon. Lovely to jump aboard, scream if you want to go faster, etc. Thank you for having me.
Really good of you to join us. So Barry has chosen the issue of The Hits that we'll be looking at, which takes us all the way back to the 25th of March to the 7th of April 1987, with the Mission's Wayne Hussey filling up the cover in his finest goth attire. And if you want to read along with us, you can do just that, thanks to a couple of amazing websites, Brian McCloskey's Like Punk Never Happened or Smash Hits Remembered. You'll find the links to the scans of this issue in the show notes, along with Spotify and YouTube playlists that include pretty much all the songs and artists featured in this thrill-packed edition of the mag on our website, giddypoppod.home.blog, and we'll also post them on Twitter and Facebook as well. Just search for the Giddy Carousel of Pop or at giddypoppod. So Barry, before we get stuck into this issue, can you take us back to what you were doing before Smash Hits and how you ended up being there?
So I joined Smash Hits October 86. And it still strikes me as very strange that only 3 years before that, so in 83, I was still living in Belfast and working in the public library system. I was a library assistant. I had a career path mapped out in front of me, potentially become assistant to the librarian, then assistant librarian, then potentially librarian. And I'd been there for about 2 or 3 years. And I'd been writing, here and there, and was the northern correspondent for the Hot Press, which was the sort of Irish equivalent of, say, the NME. But really was in Belfast, living with my mother and destined for a career stamping books and charging people 7 pence for bringing back their Catherine Cookson book 6 months later, whatever. So, I mean, it was sort of an incredibly fast process. I left the library and left Belfast in 83 to go to journalism college, postgraduate journalism course at City University in London, and at the same time to see if I could start writing and supplementing my meagre student grant back in those glory days by writing for The Melody Maker, who I'd started freelancing for when I was still in Belfast. And that all worked out. So I was basically on The Melody Maker, on the staff of The Maker, as we call it, from, say, the start of 1985. And it was fantastic. You know, I was very young, single, footloose, fancy-free, travelling the world with the Pogues and Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Tears for Fears and, you know, all sorts of people. I was actually quite happy there. Although I guess looking back, I was always sort of at the pop end of The Melody Maker. The Melody Maker was obviously a bit more like the NME, a kind of a rock weekly. And I was more their pop correspondent, I guess. But very happy there. I'd only been there about a year, 18 months. And I got a phone call towards the end of 1986 from, I think, David Hepworth, who would have been the sort of editorial director of EMAP, the company that published Smash Hits. Melody Maker was published by IPC, and those were the kind of two big players in the magazine scene at that time. And I was summoned to David's house, very kind of cloak and dagger, on a Sunday evening. I can still remember it, although it's 34 years ago, believe it or not. And then I was being summoned there for an interview, a chat. I think it was probably billed as, but really an interview for the editorship of Smash Hits, which had become vacant because the previous editor, Steve Bush, who was the art director when Dave was there, had left. I think he'd gone to Australia to set up a magazine over there, and they were looking for a new editor. But now, to this day, I don't really know why. They approached this young, pretty inexperienced, not long out of Belfast, former librarian, currently on The Melody Maker. It's not the most obvious fit. But I went to Dave's house, which I'll talk a bit about if you like, and not long after was appointed editor of Smash Hits at the start of October 1986.
You say you remember going to Dave's house on that Sunday night. So what happened? If it was all cloak and dagger and stuff?
It was all very cloak and dagger. And Dave had said that it would be him and a guy called Tom Maloney, who's a crucial part in all of these stories, because Tom was essentially the managing director of that part of EMAP that published Smash Hits. And at this point, just 17, I think, as well. And it was quite church and state. I mean, there was more of a blurring of church and state than anywhere else I've ever worked. But Dave would have headed up the church, which was the creative editorial side. And Tom was heading up the state, the kind of the more business publishing side, which didn't mean that Tom Maloney didn't have very strong views on editorial, or that Dave, was completely naive when it came to the business. But there was a sort of slight separation. And he had said that Tom Maloney would therefore be there as the person, I guess, with the ultimate authority. And of course, being at IPC at that moment, I mean, I didn't even know who the managing director or chief executive of IPC was, but I'm pretty sure he was about 75 years old and sort of, would get a fast lift up to the 55th floor of the tower. And I got to Dave's house, and there was a very young guy sitting on a chair. And I knew Dave because he had been presenting the Old Grey Whistle Test, and he had also just done Live Aid, which would have been the year before this. He was one of the main anchors at Live Aid. So Dave was a sort of public figure, and I knew who he was. But Dave would probably been in his late 30s at this point. I was in my early mid-20s, and I thought, this must be, or maybe that's Dave's son, this guy sitting there. Maybe Dave had kids really young or something, And this sort of youngster stood up and put his hand out and said, "Hello, I'm Tom Maloney." I thought, wow, I think I'm going to work here. This is exciting, because he was younger than me and he was the managing director. I was like 26, he was 25. It just felt like this incredibly kind of youthful, creative, vibrant pair of people. And they interviewed, I mean, it turned into quite a serious interview. And I remember going back after it to my girlfriend at the time and saying to her, "Well, I've got no chance of that." I mean, that was a complete disaster. And I don't know to this day, as I say, whether, in the movies, if they try to get De Niro, and then they can't get De Niro and they try Pacino, and if they can't get Pacino, they get Joe Pesci. I think I might have been the Joe Pesci. I secretly think they maybe had a couple of others who had interviewed better. And I don't know. And I've always been too frightened to ask either Tom or Dave, who are very good friends to this day. I've always been too frightened to actually ask them, even now, "Why did you actually hire me?" But I got the job when I started, and my first cover was Nick Kamen. I think you can always, if you're being an editor of a magazine, you always remember your sort of first cover and your last cover. So I went from Nick Kamen, October 86, and my final farewell cover was Nena Cherry. And those two covers, I mean, they bookend, you could sort of see what happened during that period. Nena Cherry was introducing a whole new age. So Nick Kamen was my first cover. But that's not the one I've chosen. We will come to that.
So what was your awareness of smash hits before you actually started on the mag?
It was regarded as a bit of an irritant at first. So if you were on the Melody Maker or the NME, Smash Hits was very annoying because it had come from nowhere. I mean, it had only launched in 78, 79. And with the whole sort of Duran Duran, Spandau, Wham, people like that, Culture Club era, it had really taken off. So it was starting, well, it had started and had become a real challenger, real kind of insurgent. And I think because it was published by EMAP, who at that point were an unknown force. At this point, we should have the standard pop quiz question, which is, do any of our listeners know what EMAP actually stood for? EMAP? Do we know? Do either of our co-hosts in the carousel know the answer to this?
I don't know.
Is it East Midlands Associated Press or something like that?
So close. East Midlands Allied Press.
Allied Press. As a former EMAP employee, I should know.
I should know that. It was colloquially known as endless meetings and parties, which was actually closer to the truth. And it was this sort of regional newspaper group.
Yeah, because they're based in Peterborough.
It was based in Peterborough,
yeah.
Published the Peterborough Evening Telegraph, the Stamford Mercury. It was a solid local newspaper organisation that had started to move into magazines, Peterborough-based at first, with things like Motorcycle News, was the sort of flagship title. And then Smash Hits was its first, I suppose, move into the glossy, it wasn't called that then, the London youth magazine market, which, as I say, would be dominated really, I suppose, by IPC and to a lesser extent by DC Thomson. So if you were working at IPC, as I was, at Melody Maker, Smash Hits was very much the kind of the new kid on the block, which we probably didn't take as seriously as we should have, but because there was very much an enemy in Melody Maker, like we are, the cool kids, we're writing about the people that matter, whereas Smash Hits, a writer asking people what colour their socks are, a question that actually was never asked by anyone on Smash Hits ever. So, I mean, that's why, as I say, I was a very unlikely choice, but it was quite a risk, I think, it must have been looking back on it, this guy from the Melody Maker. But as I say, I suppose I was at the poppier end. I mean, and funnily enough, when I went for that interview that fateful Sunday night, I remember I was actually on tour with 5 Star for the Melody Maker, which is a strange thing for the Melody Maker to have covered. If you remember 5 Star, Delroy Pearson and the gang, and I would have been the only person in Melody Maker interested in doing that. So I remember leaving the 5 Star tour in Glasgow or somewhere and coming back to London, going to Dave's house, meeting the boy like Maloney. And I realised quite early on it was a whole different ball game. I mean, not only was I the editor, whereas on Melody Maker I'd I'd been a staff writer and then the sort of reviews editor or something. But also, it was a huge business. Even though, as I say, it was David who was in charge of the creative side. You were expected to have a grasp of what you were doing, not just on the page, but how that fitted in terms of marketing and advertising and publishing. And I mean, I learned everything on that, in those 3 years. And really, I mean, it's now 34 years later. So, you can do the maths. I was 25 when I started. My entire life and my entire career really are entirely down to that Sunday night and getting that job at Smash Hits. And you don't realise that at the time. You never realise in life this is your big break. You just think, oh, I've got a new job, Mum. So sort of thing called Smash Hits. But actually, it all goes back to that fateful meeting.
How did your ex-colleagues on Melody Maker greet the news when you turned up and said, oh, by the way, I'm going off to be editor at Smash Hits?
Well, yes. Well, I mean, one of my mentors was Alan Jones, the legendary, larger-than-life editor of Melody Maker, who published a book a few years ago called Stop Me If You've Heard This One Before, which was basically a collection of all the anecdotes that I had heard before because he told me them all in the pub. And he was really good about it because Jonesy had kind of adopted me, and had given me that break when I moved from Belfast. And I think he knew that maybe my heart was more towards, that poppier end of things, and that actually I'd been at this time a Melody Maker, if you add in the sort of freelance period, for 4 or 5 years, and I was a young man, I had ambitions, I suppose. So he was pretty good about it, and I remember Tom Maloney saying, look, you've got to get out of there and get in here within 2 weeks. And I was probably on a month's notice or 3 months' notice, and he was very good about it. And we had a leaving do, and it was all very, above board. But the minute I got to Smash Hits and EMAP, as I say, I realised that this is a whole different level of responsibility and accountability, but also, Smash Hits was the coming thing, and it was already selling when I got there 400,000, 450,000 copies a fortnight. It's just on a scale that's hard to imagine now. And I didn't know at that point, and we can talk about this. There are all sorts of reasons, but we would get to a million copies within those 3 years. So. I mean, it was an absolutely golden period. Looking back on it at the time, like anything, it was hard work, and my memories of it are late nights and staff politics and people problems and pay reviews and all the usual things. But I did also, I hope, have some sense of how bloody lucky I was to be a part of it.
And so were you eyed with any suspicion then? So turning the tables a little bit, eyed with any suspicion when you turned up at the Smash Hits offices? So you were still at Carnaby Street at that time, yeah?
We were at 52 to 55 Carnaby Street. The office very, very beautifully described by David Hepworth in his recent appearance on the Carousel. I think we were on the second floor. We had just 17 above us. But yes, I was viewed with understandable suspicion. And a kind of jokey assumption that I would just only want to listen to and talk about and feature Bruce Springsteen and U2 and the Sisters of Mercy and, whoever Melody Maker at that point had been championing. And to some extent that was true. Those were the people I would listen to. But, I mean, one thing about Smash Hits, which is really interesting, is very few of the people on it who worked on it were going home and listening to the people that were in the magazine. They had always had this very sort of strange setup where you were completely devoted. If you were working in Smash Hits, you were completely devoted to the readers and to what they wanted. And so it didn't matter really if you liked or didn't like the people who needed to be in the magazine, because they were the ones that the readers were buying the records of. And your sort of personal life, particularly when it came to what you listened to or what you liked doing, was completely incidental and separate. So you had this very interesting variety of people working on it, of all ages and all backgrounds. And the only thing that united them was that, every morning they would come to the office and think, right, what is 15-year-old Karen in Crawley want to be in this magazine? And the fact that, you could be Neil Tennant and in your late 20s and listening to Al Stewart, that didn't matter. We all had this kind of discipline, which was unshakable.
And who was working there at the time? Was there anybody that you already knew when you started working there?
The only person I would have sort of known of would have been Dave Hepworth, and Dave's involvement was more editorial director. So at this point, Dave, he had successfully done smash hits. They had launched Just 17. They had just launched Q. So Q had just launched in 86, about a month before I got there, I think. So he would have been more involved. He was starting to get more involved with that. Mark Ellen, I also knew, obviously, from television, from the Whistle Test and from Live Aid. But Mark was, by this point, editing Q, so he would have been in a different office. They were in Great Portland Street, just round the corner. So no, I didn't really know any of the staff. And there was a challenge in that as soon as I arrived, I realised that part of the reason why they'd appointed me was because there were some problems with what was always referred to as the previous regime. It's like regime change. And I never quite worked out what that was, because it was clear that my job was not to worry about that. It was just to make sure that there was a new regime. There were a few people who didn't last very long after I joined, either because they just didn't like the cut of my jib or because, whatever reason. And the sort of mainstays became Tom Hibbert, who became deputy editor and who was this fantastic, eccentric character. Chris Heath, who I think became deputy after Tom. Chris was younger than me. This very sort of soft-spoken, incredibly clever guy who has gone on to write the definitive books on the Pet Shop Boys and Robbie Williams, and who I met up with last year in Brooklyn, where he now lives. And we went, like a couple of old media chancers, to the Dumbo House, part of the Soho House group in Brooklyn, and at breakfast looking over Manhattan, talking about what we're talking about right now, about smash hits in 1987 and 1988, in a lovely, moment. I hadn't seen him for years. And it's funny, there's no other magazine that I've ever worked on that bond is still there, where 30 years later, if I was to meet Sylvia Patterson on the street, we'd hug and we'd chat. And so I didn't know them, but there became a sort of tight-knit crew pretty quickly. Myself, Tom, Chris, Sylvia, Jackie Doyle, the art director from Dublin, Darren Schlesinger, very important figure on it, went on to make TV programmes, William Shaw. I always think a sign of a good staff is also what they go on to do, and most of those people have gone on to have amazing careers. Mike Sutar, we'll talk about later, And this was all coming out of this little room in Carnaby Street. And all of us at that time, with the exception of Tom probably, all in our early mid-20s, given absolute freedom to kind of run riot. As long as we didn't make too big a mess of it, which might take us to the issue in question.
Talk us through this issue, and without giving too much away, why you chose this particular issue. Like I say, it's from end of March 87 with Wayne Hussey from The Mish on the front.
I guess I chose it, well, put it like this. When I go out wearing my PPA hat, so as you said at the intro, I've been running the PPA, which is the kind of industry body for UK magazines for 10 years now. And a large part of that is going to conferences and colleges. And I went to, this seems like a long, distant golden age now, only a couple of months ago, when we were still able to go out of the house, I went up to Newcastle as part of this Speakers for Schools initiative that Robert Peston set up a few years ago, where people who have careers, not just in the media, go into state schools and talk, and don't get paid. In fact, we pay the whole thing, expenses. We talk to the students about our our career. And the teacher said to me, "Could you possibly talk about any failures that you've had in your career?" And I said, "Well, there are no shortage of those," because there's sometimes the assumption you've had this unbridled run of success, which couldn't be further from the truth. And I used this cover in front of about 200 students, 14 and 15-year-olds. Only a couple of months ago, as an example of how to fail, and how failure can often, you can learn as much from it, if not more, than you can from a runaway success. So that's one reason I chose it, because I talked about it recently, and also because I guess it illustrates some of the conflict that we've just been talking about. It's a very ex-Melody Maker front cover. And it's probably the last cover that I did that I strayed too far on. And if you look at the covers that come after that, they really start to hit their stride. And so this would have been me 6 months in, not really entirely yet sure of what I'm doing, to be honest. And having a bit of a punt and thinking, hey, this guy worked in the Melody Maker, let's try that. And realising very quickly that we're in two different worlds here.
Yeah, because when you look at, I've got the book here, The Best of Smash Hits, the 80s, and it's got a gallery of all the covers in the back. So you look at the covers from that Nick Kamen one where you came in, and the last one of 86 has got the House Martins on the cover. And so it's not really a massive leap or a surprise, really, to see the Mission on the cover. And I was 13 at the time when this came out, and I was certainly going out and buying Mission records. The singles that they'd had out in 86 and 87, I thought were fantastic. So I would have been well pleased to have seen the Mission in there.
I mean, I think. So when I say failure, I mean, just to get into it, I think. So what I asked those students was, can anybody out there say who should have been on this cover? So if you look at that front cover, there is a very obvious choice of somebody who actually should have been the cover. And just in case people don't have it in front of them, the answer to that is very obviously Janet Jackson. So the choice I had to make at the time, I suppose there were three choices, were Wayne Hussey from The Mission, formerly the Sisters of Mercy, Margaret Thatcher, which is a whole other ball of wax, which we'll come to, and Janet Jackson. And the reason why it's a failure is entirely to do with the whole strategy behind Smash Hits was driven by the top 40. So the reason why we were able to include anybody from the Nolans through to Bros was not because anybody thought Bros were better than the Nolans or that Iron Maiden weren't allowed in, because all those people would be in the magazine if they were in the top 40. So to some extent, you were trying to align the magazine to the charts. And generally, the covers, the issues that sold the most, were the people who were having the most success at that time in the top 40, whether that be Duran Duran a few years previously or Rick Astley of Roddy Great Pig fame, as you just talked about. So that's the other reason why there was no individual bias. It didn't matter. I quite like Van Morrison. Van Morrison was not in Smash Hits, not because of what he sounded like or what he looked like, but because during this period he probably never had a hit. If he'd had a hit, he would have been in it. So the reason why this fails is because the chart used to come out. They used to announce the chart, I think, on a Tuesday morning. Mike Smith or whoever it would have been at the time would do the rundown. And my decision to put Wayne Hussey in the cover would have been all about a bet, if you like, that the Mission would be higher in the chart than Janet Jackson. And I can still remember I had a company car at the time. This was one of the few measures of success of that you'd made it, was you had a company car. I had a Ford Sierra, formerly belonging to the ad director, and I was driving into the West End. And Mike Smith's doing the countdown, and the magazine's gone to bed. It's at the printers, it's about to come out. And he's counting down the top 40, and the Mission have gone in at, I don't know, number 32 or something. And that's bad enough. But I'm now just thinking, we've just got to hope that Janet Jackson hasn't gone into the chart because he's got the 20 and he hasn't mentioned it yet. 19 and at 18, 17. It's a bit like Pointless, Although, please God, And of course, in at number 4 is Janet Jackson, and just the scale of the mistake becomes apparent. I had to pull the car over to the side of the road, silently sobbing practically, because I'm still on probation from a purely selfish point of view. I'm probably still on a 6-month probation period, and the magazine's doing okay at this point, but it hasn't taken off. It's probably selling what it was selling the day I walked in, 400, 450. And this is just a very obvious mistake, because not only is he a gamble because it's Wayne Hussey, but clearly nobody's really buying the record. And you've managed to hang on a minute, you've got a world exclusive with Janet Jackson with some fantastic pictures of her blowing bubble gum. And P.S., you may not know this, you oaf, having been on the Melody Maker, she's Michael Jackson's sister. Did you know that? And we haven't been able to speak to Michael Jackson in 5 years since Mark Ellen interviewed him on the phone one night. So this is, even if nothing else, she is the way into Michael Jackson, who's the single biggest pop star of the moment. And you've put this guy from somebody called The Mission in a pair of dark glasses on the cover. What are you thinking of? So I had that conversation with Maloney, really, to some extent with Hepworth. And I suppose what I took away from it was just this real, this is serious business here. There's a lot, not only is there your credibility at stake, but if you're selling 500,000 magazines at 48p a go, and you're having advertisers beat down the door to get into it, there's a lot of money at stake as well. And if you were to suddenly start selling 300 or 200, that's not going to play very well. And there will be a new editor of Smash Hits, So, it was my first editorship. I was relatively inexperienced, and I'd sort of made not a kind of career-ending blunder, but it would not have been beyond the realms of possibility for them to say, do you know what, you're not quite right for this. If you can't work out that Janet Jackson is more Smash Hits than this fool in a hat and glasses, then off you go. Thankfully, they didn't do that.
Do you remember what the sales figures were for this magazine? Did it take a noticeable dip? Do you remember?
I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure it didn't go up.
Yeah, that's I think we can probably agree.
I think the saving grace might have been that we got Thatcher, which sort of still, I'm just looking at it here. I've got the issue on my iPad. Just the whole Thatcher thing. I mean, nowadays it's quite common. You have these ridiculous things where Gordon Brown pretends that he likes the Arctic Monkeys and David Cameron's into the Smiths, and you've got somebody, got a machine inside Downing Street pumping this stuff out. This would have been the first time ever that a prime minister had spoken to anybody like Smash Hits. I mean, the idea, who was before Thatcher, Jim Callaghan or Harold Wilson, seems preposterous. And I think what was happening here was a beginning of a realisation that there was such a thing as youth culture and that it mattered, and that all of these people would be coming to vote at some point, if not in the forthcoming election, then in the next one. That Smash Hits was hugely influential, at this point. If you're selling 400,000, you're being read by, 1.5, 2 million, because people are passing it around so much in the playground or whatever. And that this was an important audience. You've also got the beginning, I guess, of some kind of spin doctoring where somebody within the organisation, within government, realises, this would actually be quite a good idea. And I remember I wrote to the press secretary at Downing Street, dear Mr. Whoever, and got a letter back, because it was before email or whatever, saying the Prime Minister would be delighted. And we couldn't quite believe it. And of course we had to think who to send, and sort of, obviously we sent Hibbert. We sent Hibbs as the most eccentric, strange representative you could think of, in his, what he would have referred to as his Mr. Byright suit. And there's a picture of him, sitting with Thatcher. Thatcher obviously trying to work out what this strange creature is. And her talking about, her favourite song being How Much Is That Doggy in the Window. I mean, it's so far away from the controlled Blair era. And one of Tom's great obsessions was that Cliff Richard should be knighted. He sort of had this campaign for, and we would call him Sir Cliff Richard, Sir Cliff Richard. And of course he asks her, and she's like, you're splendid, So you can it's a classic Smash Hits feature, and you can see the two levels that we always tried to work on. One, here's a guy interviewing the Prime Minister, and two, kind of almost at the same time, this is absurd, the whole thing, that this is this very strange, creative individual interviewing this woman who probably doesn't really know what she's doing, doesn't really know, and has no spin and no interest, but has been told to do it. And I think that might have been the saving grace, in that there was certainly a certain amount of creativity and ingenuity involved, and innovation or whatever in getting it and landing it, that maybe got me off the hook when it came to choosing Wayne Hussey over. I still can't bring myself to say it, over Janet Jackson.
I was just checking the chart stats actually, and the singles that were out at the time this magazine was out. The Mission got to number 25 with Severina. Ooh. And Janet Jackson all the way to number 3 with Let's Wait a While.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
But I think people don't realise how much the charts were the driver behind it, and it made life easy in a way, because it was like, should Philip Schofield, should he be in Smash It? Well, has he got a single out? Yeah, okay. If he doesn't, no. It made it very democratic, So that's why, as I say, U2 are in there, and some sort of hoary old rock stars are in there, and because they've got a single out and their kids are flocking to buy it, and sort of who are we to say that they shouldn't be in there? And it made it very democratic and almost very easy to work out the hierarchy of who's in there and how much coverage you give them.
Well, should we look at the rest of the cover here? So this would have cost you 45 pence, or 3 Deutschmarks in Germany, or Singapore, what's that, 3 Singaporean dollars. So as well as the Mission, the quote here, I've got lovely legs and I'm perfect, from Wayne Hussey.
We're struggling here, let's be honest.
The aforementioned Janet Jackson, Curiosity Killed the Cat, Genesis, Mel Kim, David Bowie and Lone Justice.
There's a perfect example, isn't there, of that breadth of church I was talking about.
Yeah.
You think of it.
Posters of the Jets, Boy George, Nick Cayman and Madonna. 5 more brilliant free stickers. My stickers are long gone. I can't remember which ones I got. My memory's not that good. And when we flick over to the contents page, there's a lovely shot of David Bowie, which would have pleased me greatly at the time. And along with the features that we just mentioned, song words for Genesis, Prince, Dead or Alive, The Pretenders, Cyndi Lauper, Madonna, Lone Justice, Mel Kim, Blow Monkeys, Bruce Willis, U2, Curiosity Killed the Cat, The Mission, hey, and Al Jarreau.
I mean, what an eclectic bunch.
So shall we have a look at bits then? Gav, is there anything there that leaps out to you on the first couple of pages of bits?
Oh, you've startled me there, Si. We've just glossed over David Bowie. That's not like you.
Shall we skip back to Dave? Well, he had a proper feature a few months later in Smash It, so that I remember very well.
Bowie is very interesting, because Bowie is a classic case, you see, of somebody who his record company and management would have, I'm sure, impressed upon him the importance of Smash Hits from a circulation point of view. It's selling a lot of copies, David. The kids. I suspect Bowie himself, maybe at that point, would have been more interested in The Face and The Enemy and the other magazines. And of course, our attitude to David Bowie, which takes us back to setting aside one's own personal taste, would have been, he probably would have been the person in the office that everyone loved. But we would insist that we do him on our terms. And therefore, there would always be this tension between Bowie and his people and the magazine, because they would be like, hey, we can get David Bowie. And we'd be like, well, that's great, but can we get him, bursting out of a birthday cake? And they'd say, well, don't be ridiculous. It's David Bowie, And we'd say, yeah, but that's not enough. And that came to a head a few months later in that feature you mentioned, where because he was always talking about how he was chameleon-like, we illustrated the entire thing with chameleons just sort of crawling all over the pages. And his people went ballistic, as you can imagine, when the thing came out and rung me and said, this is David Bowie, he's a major artist. You've got these chameleons on. And I was like, well, that's what we do, So this is he's probably in bits as a kind of negotiated, let's get him in at this point, and we might do a feature later on if we can get him, to, as I say, be bursting out, playing a trombone out of a cake or something. That's never happened.
I seem to remember that the feature, he was on the set of the Pepsi commercial that he was filming with Tina Turner, where she's a robot that comes to life and he's some sort of mad scientist. And I think the interview was done in a break in filming for that. I seem to remember, I haven't read it for a long time, but that when it's David Bowie, it is burned in my memory. But this particular thing that's just kind of, it's just a little feature and a rather nice photo of Dave on the set of the Never Let Me Down album cover shoot. But it's because he's got a new single out, he's got a new album coming out, and he's got a big old tour coming up, the Glass Spider tour, which everyone, I'm sure, rolled their eyes at when I mentioned that. But I think, I may be wrong, but I think that's possibly the only time the interview and feature with Bowie was the only time that he was interviewed for the mag.
Well, I think he was going through a strange period. Certainly in my time, so 86 to 89 would have been Glass Spider.
And just before Tin Machine.
just before. I mean, looking back, I can't believe how hardcore we were. But, you would get a phone call saying, I don't know, the Rolling Stones are prepared to do it. And we would still say, well, that's not quite enough. We need them to do something. And we don't want to talk to Bill Wyman or whatever. You would get to this. The magazine would get to a point of such strength and commercial importance. When you're selling 750,000 copies every fortnight, if you're the record company or the management, you're very keen to have your act in there. But you would have this tussle between the people who were still very keen to be in there, the artists included, because they needed it, and those who probably felt, I don't really need that anymore. I'm Paul McCartney, I'm David Bowie, I'm whoever, and that's where the tensions would arise, because they would feel that them coming into our world somehow maybe infantilized them or something. So Bowie, it would have been a mix of his career at a strange period and probably just not prepared, understandably so, to fool around the way that Smash Hits demanded he do.
So moving on from Dame Dave, bits proper. Gav, anything leaping out to you on those first couple of pages?
I mean, there's quite a few bits and bobs in here. Obviously, Nick Cayman makes another appearance with some previous photos he's had done for catalogues and the like. Freeman's catalogues, these are all from. But I think my favourite little thing is just a very typical Smash Hits thing that really made me laugh is a couple of pictures into bits. That picture of Morton Harkett, which is great. It's Nature in Pictures, a Bits Natural History special. It says, spring approaches fast. The buds on the trees are getting ready to burst. The sun's soft caresses warm the land. The air is full of the song of birds. Soon it will be the nesting season. Here is a picture of Morton Harkett nesting. It's just a great picture of Morton in a tree. And it's very typical kind of Smash Hits thing. That I love that.
It's also what I love looking back on it is the level of detail. So you have a birthdays list and you have Agnetha Folkstad and it says, in brackets, she's so dreamy, of ABBA 37. It's just, rather than just putting Agnetha Folkstad of ABBA, it's the time that somebody has taken to make the little gag, which most people won't notice. And that was very much what we did, and particularly in Bits. I mean, Bits was this sort of youth club part of the magazine over in the corner that William Shaw, Sylvia Patterson, Lola Borg, various people ran pretty much as a kind of independent republic. and that you could just trust them to do things like that, to make sure that it was sort of what would now be called on brand. You would obviously have been shot if you had used those words. And rightly so back then.
Well, I always call it the beating heart of Smash Hits, because it really is kind of almost like shorthand for everything that Smash Hits does, and a big part of its character, and kind of sets it up and always runs right through. Well, it's the vein that runs through the history of the mag.
It has the crap joke corner. What do you call a pop star who steals hats? Nick Berry. That's terrible. But yeah, it's quite a lot of work. I mean, even now, God, you can see. Not only is there a huge amount of little bits, hence the name of copy, all of which has to be on brand and done properly, but you've also, Jackie Doyle, who is the up-and-coming art director at this point, is doing all these hand designs. So really, you've got like actual denim running through every page here, sort of handcrafted.
Yeah, that's something we've noticed, that the theme of the surrounds on the pages of bits always changes. So we were looking at one that was from around Easter time, and it was all chocolate and chocolate eggs and things like that.
And she was fantastic at that. I mean, she would just spend hours harrowing her design team. And the magazine, I think at this point, did start to develop a real visual identity. Maybe not quite just yet, but because Jackie would have been, at this point, art director roughly the same time that I'd been editor, but really, I suppose, like all of us, because we were relatively new-ish, had started to hit our stride some point in 87, and then sort of had this amazing year in 88 where we were just selling so many copies, and also we're very lucky because people like Rick Astley and Bros and Jason and Kylie started to emerge.
I like Terence Trent D'Arby. He seems quite game.
He was for a while.
Yeah. Well, yeah, until the second album. I guess this would have been his first appearance in the mag. It was certainly at the early stages of his career.
We also we used bits as well for two reasons. I suppose one was, here are people that we're not sure about, but the record company have said this guy's going to be big, and his single's going to chart midweek at 36 or something. And you'd have a look at him, and he looked right, and and at this point he's prepared to do whatever you want him to do. So it would be used as a sort of breeding ground for potential bigger stars, and also you would use it as a potential training ground for the journalists. So you would get somebody in, and you'd think, these people look like they might be the type of people who could be in Smash Hits. Let's try them out on bits, because there would always be somebody, William or whoever, sort of experienced enough to keep an eye on it. So it was this fascinating sort of fertile breeding ground for pop stars and journalists alike.
Well, you've got some, a very good Smash Hits question. He must have been asked this question. He's never grown parsnips in a gumboot.
That's very Sylvia. That's probably Sylvia Patterson. Sylvia had just started when I got there, and was 21, 22, and had this strange pop sense, sort of, sensibility, where she would ask people things like that. What colour is Tuesday? Do eggs make a queer whistling noise when you fry them? which is fine when you're asking the up-and-coming Terence Trent D'Arby. When you're asking, Brian May of the Queen, there was a tendency to say, hang on a minute, it was never, as I say, what colour are your socks? It always had a little bit more wit to it. Parsnips, eggs, colours.
Does your mother play golf?
Because, of course, I think as Hepworth was saying, you were always trying to get them to look out, because you never really wanted them to talk about the album, how they got the bass sound on the new single. You were always trying to position the pop star in the wider world, and you always had this sort of rocking vicar kind of Ken Dodd, Mrs. Sensibility, look at this pop star, he's a funny creature. There was always that going on, and I think, as I said earlier, I think it worked at its best on two different levels. There would be, here's an interview with Bananarama, and you'd find out fascinating things about Bananarama. And for the hardcore audience, which at that time were largely 13 to 16-year-old girls, you would get that. But there were a lot of boys starting to read the magazine, and there were older people starting to read the magazine. And you would always have to sort of make sure that there was enough in there for them as well, who would really appreciate Terence Trent D'Arby being asked if he'd ever grown parsnips in a gumboot, because it's just funny, you know, and you're not going to read it anywhere else. So that kind of slightly schizophrenic, you know, dichotomy of, yes, here's one for the 11-year-old just coming into it, but here's one for the 19-year-old who's been reading it now for 3 or 4 years, and trying to keep that church broad and sell 1 million copies was, I think, when it was at its best.
So we get to our first feature in the mag, and it's 2 pages on how to make a pop video starring Curiosity Killed the Cat. Gav, do you want to take us through this one?
They seem to kind of have everyone that's working on the video, they know, don't they? They're either family or friends. They're doing a video shoot for the new single Ordinary Day. And I think, who's doing the piece? Is it Lola Borg's?
It's Lola Borg, which of course I must jump in here and say this is special because Lola Borg is now my wife and has been for the last 29 years.
So be careful what you say.
So be careful before you go any further.
Yeah, I think this is why I chose this piece, because it's so well written.
I was just speaking to her this morning and I said, I'm doing this thing today and your Curiosity Killed the Cat piece is in it. And she said, oh my God, I remember going to Ben Volpierre's mother's house and talking to her at the time. And
okay.
I mean, it's amazing because, as I said earlier, I mean, my entire career depends upon Smash Hits, but actually, I also met Lola, who worked at the time mainly on bits and Just 17, and we got married in 1991 and have 2 grown-up children together. So, you know, it's not uncommon. It was like a family, literally like a family. You know, Chris Heath was an usher at our wedding, and you know, et cetera, and yeah, it was pretty amazing. When I saw, I couldn't believe it. Words Lola Borg. So that's the missus, as they say.
Well, it's very well written. Really.
Thank you. I can tell her.
There's a bit. So the bit that made me chuckle is she's talking about the behind the scenes at the video shoot, and she says, even more bizarre is that everyone here appears to be a very close personal friend of the group, or if not, then at least a relation. Ben's brother Dominic is the group's inverted commas hairdresser. He informs me snootily. Migi's girlfriend's mother, looking very trendy in black and white first shoes, has styled, in inverted commas, the set. The producer Siobhan is, inverted commas, an old friend, as is the director. The clothes are styled by Miggy and Ben's ex-landlady. Even Miggy's dad, Andrew Drummond, an art director, has been roped in to design the sets. The set today is 4 very stylish white rooms intended, like the video, to appear ordinary yet extraordinary, according to Ben, in which Miggy's dad describes as a labour of love. How come I'm not getting paid for it? so it feels like very much a kind of bit of a shoestring operation. And, you know, and they were on a major label, and they'd had a couple of hits by this point, hadn't they, I think?
They were really interesting because they were one of the first, they were kind of a new wave that came around that time. I remember that cover, fantastic cover of Ben in the denim jacket wearing all the badges that Smash Hits pretty much made for him. And I remember doing that issue and feeling like a real shift away from where we were. They didn't last very long. I mean, there was Curiosity, there was Johnny Gates Jazz, Brother Beyond, Climby Fisher. I mean, all these groups, you know, who they, I suppose that was another factor at that time. You would have 6 months, maybe a year. And that was it. Neil Tennant, as I'm sure you know, has this theory that all pop groups have an imperial period, and it lasts for 3 years at its best, you know. And those 3 years, you can do nothing wrong. You have hit after hit, but it never lasts longer. And of course, people will always say, well, what about the Beatles? And the answer to that is they had 2. They had 2 imperial periods. They had the mop tops, and then they had the psychedelic, you know, 63 to 67, 67 to 70. Oasis, yeah, I know they lasted, but really 3 years of absolute domination. And I think in the Smash Hits world, it was even shorter. You know, you might get 2 years if you were Bros or Rick Astley, and clearly you would have some people like Madonna who would transcend the decades, but even she probably had that 3 year of absolute pomp, and Smash Hits' job was to ride that with them. And get right into the middle. Curiosity probably only had 9 months.
I was going to say, it's a matter of months for Curiosity. My favourite bit was Nick from Curiosity Killed the Cat. Who I looked it up. He was the bass player. I wanted to know what his role was in the band, so he was the bass player. He's worrying that because he's wearing an anorak, he looks like a house martin, and he's desperately asking for an opinion.
Looking for assurance.
Do I look like a house martin?
God forbid he should look like somebody from the House Martins. But we'll leave Curiosity there, and we'll just look briefly at RSVP, which was the Pen Pals page. And whenever we get to this, we're always staggered that you always get people's full names and addresses printed in the mag. And normally you get people from around the world. There's somebody from Saudi Arabia on this one. But other than that, it's largely UK based. And Gav, you've been playing detective.
I have, yeah. This is a new Giddy Carousel of Pop first. Actually got in touch with someone who advertised in this RSVP for Pen Pals, because as I was looking through it, I found a name of someone that looked quite an unusual name, and I thought, I'll just have a quick look on Facebook, see if I can find this person. Straight away found them, and they were easy to identify because the town was the same as the town that's mentioned here. But it's someone that was really a guy called Mark, who was completely mad on the Human League and basically wanted to write to anyone that was a fan of Phil and his mob. And so I just sent him a quick message on Facebook, and I just said, I'm presuming this is you. And I just wondered if you got many pen pals through the magazine and if you're happy to share any memories. So, yeah, he wrote back straight away. Very nice chap. He said, I was inundated with letters every day. He said, I put this small ad in the magazine asking for other fans to contact me. I had a dozen or so pen pals from it. I was sent tapes of live concerts and rare tracks. It was amazing. Best of all, someone gave me Ian Burden's telephone number. I spoke to him a few times. Really nice guy. I said he was a legend. He said he wasn't. The bin men were more important than him. So there we go. So through that, he got in touch with, your actual member of the Human League. And, yeah.
I loved RSVP because I think you heard this from Dave Hepworth, but it was an astonishing thing, that no longer would exist, because it's all about pen pals, and you have to write, you have to then go get an envelope, put a stamp on it, go to the post office, post it, wait for it to come in. But the mail bag that we used to get was just sacks of mail. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Just Postie would come along, Carnaby Street, sort of weighed down, with these bags. And there's a lovely innocence to it, I think, when you look at it now, both in how they write, but also just of those times, and you had to be careful even then to try to weed out people who were using it for their own purposes. But, the vast majority of it is as innocent as it appears, and it's just a very sweetness to it, sitting in your bedroom, 13, 14, loving Madonna, the Human League or whatever, and wanting people who also like that to write to you. And it just feels like a very kind of lovely, long gone age.
It does. It feels like ancient history now, doesn't it, looking back at this?
It's incredible. It is. Hi, calling all mambas, willing sinners and gutter hearts. We're two females desperate for someone to write to. If you worship Mark Almond, and like T-Rex, The Mission, Sex Gang Children, Bauhaus, etc., etc. I mean, I remember it being more the sort of pure bros, but that's actually quite broad and quite kind of enemy territory. You've got Simple Minds, the Pogues, the Cult, Gene Loves Jezebel. But I love that, just conjuring up that image of those sort of lonely teenagers sitting in bedrooms all over Britain, sending this letter off and kind of in the blithe assurance that somebody would write back, and they did.
Well, let's take a look at the Margaret Thatcher interview, shall we?
Wow.
Come with us, why don't you, inside the hallowed portals of number 10 Downing Street, where the so-called Iron Lady awaits your pleasure. And straight away, what I liked about just the design of this one is that the main headline, the Margaret Thatcher interview, is done in that Jamie Reid Sex Pistols poison pen letter style.
That's true.
Of cut out letters from newspapers, which I thought quite a subversive way to put this feature in there.
It's incredible. I mean, it's Thomas straight in with it, as you say, and he goes, I present the Prime Minister with the token of your affection, a black tight tea towel which he actually did, which he appears to mistake for a fairy liquid advertisement. Have you seen that in a Net Newman fairy liquid advertisement in television, she asks. Lovely, lovely. And it's just, it's like, it's a very surreal piece. And Tom knows exactly what he's doing here.
Yeah, well, he almost calls her out straight away in what he says in the intro.
Yeah.
And then we embark on the interview itself, which she displays an eagerness to please, combined with a skill in evasion, riding roughshod over interjections that mark her out as the professional she is. Margaret Thatcher is a serious politician, and she wants your vote. And that evasion absolutely runs through it.
And the pull-out quotes, which we always put great time on. I'm so sad that Elton John is having this difficulty, with his throat. So it sounds quite like, as opposed to that other difficulty that we don't want to talk about.
And also the photos of stars from bygone eras. Arthur Askey. Who's that there? The Tornadoes. Lovely.
Adam Faith, always melodious. That's the caption. That's our quote.
The Beatles, tuneful songs. But I thought what was a good example of the evasion is on the first page in the last column. How do you react to today's left-wing pop acts? The House Martins, the Style Council, Billy Bragg, who can't wait to get you out of number 10. So he's just Tom's straight in there, not pulling any punches. And so, can't they? Ha ha ha. Well, I remember when I went down to Limehouse Studios, and immediately she just turns it around into something else.
And there's then he just goes straight to it. When are you going tonight, Cliff Richard?
Yes.
There's no build-up. Cliff Richard has done wonders. It was he, and she just sort of talks nonsense, really. I remember him coming back, and just the whole office, for one sort of stopping, saying, how'd it go? What was she like? Because it was such a moment, and Hibbs would just give that sort of grin and say nothing, and light up a cigarette and start typing, and 3 hours later you had it. It was amazing.
What was Tom like to manage, Barry?
Well, Tom had been brought into the magazine, I think, with Mark Ellen. He was a close friend of Mark's. He was older, or he seemed older. I think he was older, but he certainly seemed older. And you didn't really manage him, is the honest answer to that. You sort of let him be, because he kept peculiar hours. My abiding memory is of him sitting, chain smoking, bashing away on the old typewriter, and just he lived in his own world, and very much that world that comes into smash hits with the strange expressions and phrases. And he would always do the coming up next week page, which was the most surreal page in the magazine, and you sort of let him go with that, because it wasn't that important. But he was an extraordinary character. And, sadly died some years ago, and, we were all at the funeral, which unfortunately has become, as one gets older, you start doing as you go to the funerals of people you used to work with. But I think everyone who was on it would have said he was the kind of guiding spirit of smash hits for that entire period, really. And I've never actually managed or worked with anyone quite like him, and I mean that in a kind of good and bad way, but overwhelmingly good.
Yeah, it feels like a real one-off, a complete sort of maverick, and but just such an energy and a spirit to him. And really, it feels when you read the smash hits from around this period, a large part of his personality is stamped onto the magazine in terms of the vocabulary and the humour, and just that what you were saying before about that kind of sense of fun with it, as kind of taking it seriously, but taking the piss as well at the same time.
Yeah, he brought a lot of that, and he was incredibly kind of kind to me, because, he would have had no ambition to be editor, but he was technically the most senior person. He'd been on it the longest, and he was the oldest, and I'm sure that he, more than anyone, would have thought, who is this guy, when I arrived. But actually, we did strike up something of a bond, and maybe because I suppose, let him be. I think the worst thing to do with Tom would have been to have said, okay, we start at 9:30 and you've got 1 hour for lunch, and, Tom would drift off to a nearby hostelry quite often, And I just took the attitude of the stuff he's producing is sensationally good. I don't really care how he does that.
Yeah.
And for a
Just give him
period
as
at
much-
least, yeah, we just give him his head, and it was fantastic. And
Yeah.
of course, he took all of that onto Q. So he started the Who the Hell column on Q. So every month on Q, they would do Who the Hell does whoever think he is. And that was Tom. I mean, for the first 60 or 70 Qs, probably it was all Tom. And it was exactly that type of writing, and that it became a little bit less comic book, because it was Q was a monthly, and it was kind of slightly older and more grown up, but it had that same worldview of, this is a funny old world, and who's this strange character? And oh, look, we appear to have John Bon Jovi with us today, listeners, and it worked even better, I think, than Q. We missed him on Smash Hits, obviously, but a lot of people, by this time, a lot of people who'd been in Smash Hits, Mark, Tom, were moving across to Q, which then went through the purple patch of its own in the probably the late 80s, early 90s.
And another thing from this Margaret Thatcher piece, and Barry touched on it earlier, was that sort of lack of awareness really on Margaret Thatcher's part about popular culture. And obviously someone had said to her, this is important, you should really have an interview with this magazine. But for example, when they're talking about Live Aid, she doesn't actually mention any of the bands that have played. Tom asks her, how did you feel about Live Aid? She says, I thought it was marvellous. I watched some of it on the Wembley thing, and it was absolutely terrific. It was the first time we'd been able to get a great body of young people, not merely interested in something, but actually doing something for it and loving doing it. And I thought it was absolutely terrific. And I watched some of that, and one group after another came and they did a marvellous job. And you're like, she doesn't know anyone that was on it at all, She doesn't even mention, U2 or, any of the sort of the big names that are on it. I wonder whether she saw any of it at all. But she's obviously not been sort of prepped for it, has she, in that way? And all the cultural references are very old.
And Hibbs asked her this, quite telling question. What would you say are the worst problems facing young people today? AIDS, unemployment. And her answer is, you always wonder what's going to happen to you in the future. I can remember as a teenager, some young marrieds I knew. They knew who they'd married. They knew what their training was going to be. It's the tremendous uncertainty and both the problem. It's just sort of gibberish. And you do, as I say, just by leaving it. He never says at any point, hang on a minute, you clearly don't know what I'm talking about. By just saying, and that's very Smash Hits, by saying, here we are, come with us, listeners, into the hallowed portals of number 10. Here we're going to meet this woman called Margaret Thatcher, and off you go. And you just let her, to some extent, hoist herself by her own petard.
Yeah.
Without ever commenting and saying, she's clearly a bit nuts in here, and is only doing this because some youngster in the department has told her to. We'd never say that. And some people will read it or would have read it at the time and thought, that's interesting, it's the Prime Minister. And a lot of people would have read it and thought, wow, that's telling in its own way.
No, she's completely of a different world. And
Yeah.
she just doesn't have any way of making that connection to the Smash Hits audience in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
Full of evasion and things like that. When he asks about the milk snatcher thing.
Yeah.
And then she just turns it all into people going out and doing things for themselves and getting a job and whatever else. She just falls back on the things that are in her world and just can't bridge that gap. But I was interested to know, did you have to send this piece back to the press office at number 10 for it to be checked?
No, I mean, the whole thing, looking back on it, was so kind of loose. As I say, I wrote to the press officer. I would have got that name from somebody. And he wrote back on a sort of formal head of paper saying the Prime Minister would be delighted to grant an interview with Smash Hits magazine, and that was as far as it went. I presume I must have rung at some point and said it's going to be Tom Hibbert and Paul Ryder doing the picks. Paul is another great old friend and kind of pretty much the staff photographer in those days. And my memory, I mean, it's a long time ago, my memory is they came back, Tom wrote it up, Paul did the pictures, we ran the piece, never heard from them. It's so uncontrolled and unlike, I know enough from still being in the game to some extent to, how that doesn't happen now.
Yeah.
You couldn't get an interview with anybody, with an MP, without going through various hoops, never mind the Prime Minister, where you just sent the photographer and the writer, they wrote it up, we printed it, end of.
Do you remember what the reaction was in the following weeks from the readers? And
funnily enough, I don't remember it being that big a deal. I mean, I think it's one of those things. It's clear now that it was a moment. That it's the first time ever that a Prime Minister has done this. But no, I mean, I think it maybe didn't land as well, as much for the audience as much as it does for us now, because we're older and we're more savvy, and we look back and think, wow, that's weird. That whole sort of lack of control and just the tone of the piece is so odd. But I think at the time, people are more interested in Janet Jackson and Curiosity Killed the Cat, is the truth of it.
But it is one of those pieces that Smash Hits is remembered for.
Yeah.
It's one of those key things.
And I'm so glad I did it. I'm so glad that we took that gamble, because it wasn't the easiest thing to put together, it wasn't hard logistically, but it wasn't the easiest thing to convince people that we should be doing, because nobody had ever done it before. And I think maybe I'm probably blowing my own trumpet here, but I think because I had come from a newspaper background, I'd worked in newspapers after the library and before Melody Maker, and maybe working in Melody Maker as well. I think maybe it's something I brought to it was, look, we could actually get the Prime Minister in here. And as I say, I was still adapting to Smash Hits, so maybe this was one of the few advantages coming from that slightly more, not political, but sort of slightly less poppy background gave. I don't know, but it probably at the time was regarded, along with Wayne Hussey, as not a mistake, but indicative of not quite knowing your audience. But here we are 33 years later talking about it.
You were right all the way along, Barry.
Thank you. Do you know what? That was just a lengthy way of saying I was right. Told you.
History has proved me right.
Yeah, told you so.
Vicky McDonald's gone to Holland with the Mission. And it sounds like they're having a thoroughly miserable time. It sounds like they're having to stay drunk to get through the experience. And there's not a lot of bright and pop happening things going on in this piece.
I like the intro. No wonder Van Gogh, brackets, mad Dutch painter who cut his ear off, close brackets, went bonkers. It's very Smash Hits, isn't it? Because it's telling you something. It's telling a 13-year-old, there was a guy called Van Gogh, and did he cut his ear off? It's not the most natural opener, and I quite like that.
And the headline of the piece is Wayne Hussey saying, "I want to be in a group that sounds like Madonna." And it follows on, "Tough luck then, matey, because you're in the Mission instead."
There was probably, office politics are a strange thing. There was probably a group within the office at that point who thought, let's just sabotage this piece. Try and get rid of this bloke. They were thinking, this should not be on the cover, and of course, rightly so. And Vicky was interesting, because Vicky was very affiliated to the previous regime, the Ancien regime. And I don't know, the funny thing is, I don't remember much about the piece or her. If you'd said to me, where did it take place, I would not have remembered Holland. And this was the Mission's moment, really, wasn't it? I mean, they probably never featured again to this extent. And I should have looked up beforehand, what is Wayne Hussey doing now? But
I can tell you, I looked it up.
Please do. Please, yeah.
He's currently in lockdown in Brazil with his wife. He lives there most of the time, splits his time between the UK and Brazil. He's got very bad Wi-Fi and broadband. It took him 3 days to upload 1.5 minutes of video. So he's not going to be doing any live streaming, but he's been going through all these old Mission demos and cassettes and things like that, and he might put some of them out. And he's been enjoying watching Killing Eve.
I'm always fascinated by people of that level, who have had a brief flirtation. It must be very strange. You're relatively young, you are pretty famous. And then you have the entire rest of your life not being that. And it's amazing how they can cope in the first place. And just also the strange lives that you must go on to have. You know, you've been the cover of Smash Hits at, I don't know, 25 years old, and now you're 60, and it's just always fascinates me.
Yeah. Well, I was going to see if I could get his attention and see if he'd got any recollections of this, but since his broadband's so bad, I thought it was a waste of time, really. He'd get it next year, so...
I was just thinking, Si, if it takes him a day and a half to upload a bit of video, how long's he taking him to watch an episode of Killing Eve each time?
That's what I was thinking.
Must take him like a whole day to watch an episode.
It must be running so slowly.
This box set's been on for a month.
Yeah. We're still only in episode 1.
So in this piece, he seems to be separating himself from the rest of the band, and that's mentioned in here.
Yes, he does. He does. He says, I don't see the Mission as being a long-term band. I mean, it has that undercurrent of slight tragedy, the whole piece, in some horrible place in Holland, and it's not really working out.
What I quite liked was that he's on the phone to Mags from Fuzzbox, who's probably the first mention of them in Smash Hits as well, who's kind of his girlfriend and kind of not his girlfriend.
I think, Si, you were saying before about the sense of Wayne Hussey being separate. There's a really nice little vignette painted, really, about how he's sort of separated himself off from the band. They've gone to have a photo session in some kind of brown field in Holland, and it says
next to a ditch.
Yeah, next to a ditch. The group have by now got through a couple of litres of plonk, and Craig and Mick run round shouting, Dick Van Dyke, Dick Van Dyke, brackets useless actor with a Dutch name who used to be in Mary Poppins films, and no one in particular. Hippyish guitarist Simon Hinkler, a man of few words but many drinks, attempts to juggle with an empty bottle and ends up hitting himself on the head. Wayne Hussey, however, remains noticeably aloof from all the hijinks. Whilst others swig lustily from their bottles and frolic about, he stands quietly to one side, sipping politely from a plastic beaker and sniggering secretively to himself now and again. It doesn't seem like a happy place to be, does it? The Mission in '87.
I think we were, and I think we were probably struggling when we got the piece because it's not the strongest cover line. I've got lovely legs, and I think I'm perfect, or whatever it is he says. Which always, you always scrabbling around if you have to do that. Really, you want something a bit stronger than that. I probably knew deep down when we got this in that it wasn't really the cover story, and why, I mean, without wishing to be obsessive about this, why I didn't at that point just think, do you know what, let's put Janet Jackson on the cover, which I'm sure people were telling me to do, but it's probably some last vestige of Melody Maker's stubbornness saying, no, where do you see, this will be right, and it wasn't. But anyway, let it go. It's 1987.
Yeah. Well, there is a paragraph towards the end. It says, they might nick ideas from here, there and everywhere, especially old rock dinosaurs, but they churn it all into their own unique sound, too tuneful to be gothic, too light of touch to be heavy metal, and too well presented to be alt-hippie-ish. They are quite simply an excellent pop group. So I didn't know if that was kind of like some justification in the piece.
I probably insisted that goes in.
Yeah. Mention they're a pop group.
Keep my job. Please pretend they're a pop group. It was interesting when I went up to Newcastle and did that talk. It was the first time I've done a talk where very few people there had ever heard of Smash Hits because they were 14 and 15-year-olds.
Yeah.
So it was the first time I've done a talk to people who had been born since the magazine closed. And I thought I might be floundering because usually that's my joker card. I could talk about the PPA for hours and then I say, if the audience are falling asleep, I say, well, you said at the magazine called Smash Hits, and immediately. And of course, at this occasion, it didn't quite work because none of the students batted an eye, but all of the teachers, a sort of a warm purr of affection went up from the teachers. And I thought, my God, that's where we've now got to. The kids don't really remember anymore because they were born, in this case, in 2005. But the teachers still remember it. And I showed this issue, and some of them remembered the Mission and Sisters of Mercy, etc.
Okay, well, in perfectly gothic fashion, shall we draw a veil over that?
Draw a veil over that.
Do you feel better now, Barry?
It still eats away at me, but I think
let it go, my friend. Let it go.
I do feel better. I do feel better. And Janet Jackson, I mean, we'll get to the Janet Jackson piece, but it is a wonderful looking piece. So I feel better, yeah.
Good.
Then we get to, I think, a very important pairing of pop stars that I think not important right now, but will come to be important for the magazine as it moves on. And that's Mel and Kim.
Mel and Kim.
One of them used to be a glamour model. The other one didn't. Meet Mel and Kim. Again, another Lola Borg piece. So it's,
is it?
Yes,
oh my God.
is. Yeah, yeah. And Gavin and I were discussing this yesterday, actually, because there's no mention of Stock Aitken and Waterman in the piece. So it's before that whole thing has really begun. And I think it's before the hit factory thing has taken hold as well, where they're just churning out formulaic nonsense. Mel and Kim, their personalities, they come through in their music, and they really come through in this piece. And I think they are probably the best of what Stock Aitken and Waterman ever did, because it was about Mel and Kim and not about them churning stuff out.
It's a fantastic single as well. It's respectable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which was, and yes, this was just the cusp of them about to become pretty big with this single. And of course, Mel and Kim were a huge part of Smash Hits for those 2 years, the years I was there. Stock Aitken and Waterman, obviously even more so. And we then had the difficulty of, the tragedy of Mel dying only 3 years after this, at the age of 23. And how you deal with that in a magazine read by, largely teenagers. And I remember, I wasn't the editor at the time, but I remember speaking to the editor who took over saying, you got to be quite delicate in how you handle that stuff, because for some people it'll be the first experience of someone they know, in inverted commas, or think they know, actually dying, and, dying so tragically young. But no, I loved Mel and Kim. I really liked Stock Aitken and Waterman, actually. I have to admit that, it was, not everyone did, but I loved that whole sort of hit factory, British Motown type thing, and just churning it out of this studio in South London. I remember the publisher saying, we need to go out for supper with Pete Waterman. And myself and the publisher went for a curry at the Elephant and Castle with Pete Waterman, who just wanted, I don't know why we did it. I think he wanted to meet me, and he was a strange character, fascinated with model railways and northern clubs, but just a kind of genius in his own way at that time, and an amazing run of hits. Mel and Kim being one of the first. Well, as you say, Mel and Kim going on to become sort of part of that stable, but at this point, he's so young as well. At this point, 20 years old.
Yeah, and I think it's a really honest piece, and there's none of that kind of Smash It's Mickey taking going on, because they're doing it to themselves.
Yes.
So they're really big personalities, and I think it's just a perfect fit for Smash Hits at this time.
I know, and it's always a bit sad when you look at Mel and Kim, actually. But the person following that you're about to get to is someone I know very well, the Blow Monkeys.
The Blow Monkeys. So the lyrics for Out With Her. So the album that the Blow Monkeys would have had out at the time was She Was Only a Grocer's Daughter, a reference to her in Number 10. Mm. So you know Dr. Robert quite well.
Well, it's strange. I go on holiday every year to a place near Granada in Spain. It just so happens been going for 20 years. And there is a lovely kind of creative community there and a recording studio, and Robert lives there.
Right.
And so I therefore got to know him just as one of the guys who goes for a coffee every morning at the local cafe in the village square, in the mountains near Granada, in this tiny little place. And we had that strange moment where I realised, oh my God, you're Dr. Robert, and he realises in the conversation you're the ex-editor of Smash Hits. And of course, he couldn't help himself. At one point, he said, "You slagged me off once." I thought, did I? And I think it was probably on Melody Maker. I probably reviewed, I don't know, an album or something. I mean, but anyway, he is now part of this setup called Monk's Road Social, which is a collective, really, of musicians. Mick Talbot, I think Weller's done some stuff on it, Matt Dayton, kind of quite, reasonably big names and great musicians, and they produced a series of albums. And they were recording it last summer. And I know this sounds like a kind of strange Smash Hits yarn, but Peter Capaldi as in the thick of it, Malcolm Tucker and Doctor Who, also goes to the same village every summer. And Peter Capaldi was in a band, years ago before he became an actor. And he wrote a song, and I was in the studio with Dr. Robert and Doctor Who as they laid down, in inverted commas, as Smash Hits parlance, the track, which is a single off the new Monks Road Social album, which he was on Joe Wiley or whatever talking about a few weeks ago before the lockdown. So it's a very long-winded way of saying how, I mean, it's so weird looking at this page, and there's Robert all those years ago, and all being well, I'll be sitting having coffee with him in a couple of months' time in our usual haunt in Spain and going up to the studio, and I must tell him I've done this. He will have something interesting to say about it, I'm sure.
Well, if it's something that you can pass on to us, then please do.
He's a lovely man and is doing some really good stuff during the lockdown and putting it up on his Facebook page. I mean, yeah, I've still got this fascination with musicians. When you actually see somebody who can play a number of instruments, and it's just a great gift. I don't have it. And even just sitting in the bar some nights with him, and he brings his guitar with him, and he starts playing, I do still have that kind of, how do you do that? So I'll say hello to him.
Please do. Underneath that, Bruce Willis, the lyrics for Respect Yourself, his cover.
I've literally forgotten that completely. Had you not? I never would have known that he did that.
I remember that he did it, yeah. But I mean, the Kane Gang had only had it in the charts a few years before. But when I was listening to it on the playlist, I'm thinking, because there's a female vocalist on there, who's that? Somebody who can actually sing on this record. It's June Pointer from the Pointer Sisters.
Wow.
But yeah, Bruce Willis, wow.
I mean, again, it's a classic example of the democracy of smash hits, if you like, because why is he there? Because he's going to single out. Well, whatever, is he a proper pop star? Not really. He's probably in Moonlighting at this point.
Yes, yeah.
Die Hard, maybe before Die Hard.
Before Die Hard, yeah.
But it's like he's in because he's got to single out, and Sue Miles or whoever was doing it, will have had to sit there in the office and, with the headphones on and transcribed every single word of it. Respect yourself, respect yourself. If you look at the final chorus, it's just respect yourself. But if she got one of those wrong, if she missed one of those off, we would be inundated with letters saying, in the Bruce Willis lyric, you missed off the fifth line of the chorus. So that's another abiding memory. It's just there would constantly be somebody sitting with headphones on, transcribing lyrics because you had to get it absolutely right.
Moving on, we get, the lady that possibly should have been the cover story. Watch your head, Janet Jackson's about. She seems so calm and dainty, but when the urge overcomes her, you just can't see the sky for grapes. Tom Hibbert faces the fruit. So, yes, it begins with Janet Jackson's confession that she likes to throw fruit out of her hotel room and says, don't tell her mom. There's probably not a huge amount here when you look at it. I mean, she will not have given, I would have thought, a fantastic interview because the Jacksons were just so controlled, and so careful about what they said and didn't say. As I say, the main thing for us from a smash hits point of view would have been, this is Michael Jackson's sister. So it's the closest you're going to get to God, for the foreseeable future. And Mark Ellen had done I think it was the last ever Michael Jackson interview, probably 3 years before this, which is a whole story all in itself. And he still has the tape. It was a phone interview. And he had to pretend, the interview was meant to be with Ian Birch, who was another big name in the world of smash hits. And Ian had to go home or something. So, and because it's just with those people, it's too complicated if you introduce any surprise into it. So Mark had to do the interview as Ian Birch, pretending he was Ian Birch. I mean, the whole thing is just nuts. And he used to play it. Mark used to play this interview at EMAP conferences, when all the editors were there, of sort of, here's our strange world. Here's my 10 minutes pretending to be Ian Birch for Michael Jackson on the phone into LA. And I think it was the last time he ever spoke, probably to the music press. So, of course, Janet Jackson, in her own right, as I say,
is about to have a big hit, much bigger than The Mission, but we're going to move on from that. We've had therapy over the years for that. And it's like the pictures are really good. We actually, Julian Barton, I think, seem to remember, did the pictures. You know, so to get a photo session with her, it's one along from Michael Jackson. That's what makes it more than what she probably had to say for herself.
Well, Michael is mentioned here and there throughout the piece that there's a potential rift between the two, and Tom says it's because your dancing was too saucy, and he has to explain to Janet what saucy means. But the bit that I liked was you get a little slice of life at home with the Jacksons. We do have family gatherings, and the entire family will just spend an entire day together, just talking and playing games. We'll play arcade games. My mother's crazy about Trivial Pursuit, so we'll all get in a game of that. And every time my mother or my brother Tito wins, I'm not too good, and my brother Michael, well, he's not too good, so no one else ever wins.
I mean, it's classic. I mean, what you can see behind this, I think, behind the scenes, is probably the brief to Tom would have been just ask her about Michael Jackson. Find out as much as you can about Michael Jackson. The record company insistence would probably have been she's not going to talk about Michael Jackson. And you've then got the clash between those two lying behind the entire thing. So anything she will have said about Michael Jackson or her family will have been absolutely maxed here, you know. And she will have wanted to talk about stuff she wants to talk about which, frankly, nobody would have much interest. So there will have no doubt, I think, have been a slight dynamic behind the scenes of this between us wanting her to talk about her brother and her not wanting to talk about that.
She talks about a pet llama.
Well, it's bizarre because so this is 87, so either later in 87 or 88, Michael Jackson comes to the UK to do the famous Bad Tour, I think it would have been, at his absolute height when he did 6 nights at Wembley Stadium or something. And as part of this, you know, he's not going to do any one-on-one interviews, but a small group, myself included, were invited for dinner with him at the Guildhall, and there were probably 6 of us. And I think I may be right in saying that Piers Morgan was one of them, because at the time he would have been running the Bazaar column in The Sun, so it would have been 5 national Fleet Street pop editors plus me as the editors/hits, and we sit. I mean, again, I wish I could remember more. I remember he was wearing the full regalia, the kind of the military outfit, the sash, the white gloves.
Yeah. And
Bubbles was on the tour with him, but to my disappointment, was not actually in the room, unfortunately, at the Guildhall. And he said, I remember he didn't have the strongest of handshakes, and he had a very strange voice. You know, hi Barry, and that would have been. That's all I can remember. I don't think. It was a sort of him plus security plus minders and managers and 6 of us, I don't know, 12 people having dinner. I mean, how mad, you know, is that? What did you do last night? I had dinner with Michael Jackson.
What did you have to eat? Can you remember?
I could call only, I think why it was in the Guildhall, I don't know. But the unfortunate thing, of course, with Michael Jackson is because of the allegations against him, you know, of recent years, it's harder to remember, you know, just the kind of the sheer pop genius that he was. And again, when I was doing that talk in Newcastle, you know, we went to the Q&A and the kids said, you know, who's the most famous person you've ever met? You know, which is what people always want to know. And I said, oh, yeah, well, you know, I had dinner with Michael Jackson. I could see the teacher wanting me to move on rather quickly. Anybody else? You know, because of course, unfortunately, you know, he's not known now just for, you know, what we knew him as, which was this kind of pop genius working with Quincy Jones doing these amazing records, which is sad, you know. But I need to freshen up my act, I realised.
So who would the substitute, your second most famous person be then?
Well, I suppose, I mean, I always, we're probably not far from on the issue. I've got a long association with U2.
Yeah.
Who in fact are the next lyric.
Oh, we'll get to them in a few moments then. Gav, any pieces from this that stand out to you? I thought it was quite a fun piece, actually.
It was a very fun
Hibbert,
piece.
It's
Tom Hibbert. It's always going to be fun, isn't it? He's always going to find the unusual and the strange angle.
Yeah.
I picked out the same bit about Trivial Pursuit and Scrabble just because I thought that was a nice image of the Jackson family playing together. But also, the stuff, Barry, you mentioned Bubbles before, and there's quite a bit about animals in here. And I'm just wondering, having watched Tiger King recently on Netflix, I'm thinking it might be quite a good signifier for just how bonkers people are. But the more wild and exotic animals they've got, the madder they probably are. She's talking about the deer. She says... one of the deer, the father, he hurt one of the babies. He hurt the baby and he broke his neck. So he died, but they had another baby and it was a girl this time, not a boy. So he separated the father from the mother and the baby, and all she does is eat. And she's bigger than her mother now, and she's so pretty. And then we've got another llama. Her name's Lola. And it goes on like this. And then there's stuff about meeting Bubbles, and Michael's been teaching Bubbles tricks. And he says he's learning to roller skate now. He'll take a few steps and then he'll fall on his side. I went down to where Michael was filming his film short, and I saw these little roller skates, and I thought they were for a little kid. And then I found out they were Bubbles roller skates, and they're white, and they've got like a star on the side of the skates, and they've got red wheels. And then Tom says, and on she rattles about the wonders of the animal kingdom, saying she still wants to own a king cobra. And it just goes on. But I mean, it's an interesting window into the world of the mega famous and mega rich and slightly unhinged.
I mean, I watched all of Tiger King and thought exactly that. And you sort of get used to it now, don't you? Bubbles has become such a part of folklore, but it is a bit nuts. He takes a chimp with him, who we get into the lift with him.
Yeah.
And we, as I say, we'd be at the Guildhall and we'd sort of be slightly disappointed. Oh, Bubbles isn't joining us. It's a chimpanzee, and I think exactly that.
I was just thinking, looking at the photo of Janet with a key dangling out her ear, and she's wearing the same thing in the video that's on the video playlist. And I'm wondering if she has a problem with it. Does she need a keyring aid?
That's good.
Okay.
If you work on that, if you do some work on that, it's good.
I thought I'd worked it up already, Barry. I didn't need any more work. You're a tough crowd.
Moving on. We get U2, the lyrics for With or Without You, the first single from the Joshua Tree. So this is where U2 catapult into superstardom and filling stadiums the world over, and the beginning of, I guess, U2 Incorporated.
Yeah.
So Barry, you mentioned that you knew U2 a little bit.
It was pure, again, as so much in my life, just pure serendipity. I went to university in Dublin between 1976 and 1980. So U2 were just starting. And I was just starting to write when I was there. Before I went into the library system, I'd be writing reviews, trying to get them printed. And quite often they would be of U2. And of course, all they were at that point was one of a number of Dublin bands. So you would get to know them and hang out with them and have no real inclination that this was going to be, for a period at least, the biggest band in the world. How would one have known this? But then through the Melody Maker, the time I was there, interviewed them a number of times, and got to know them pretty well, as much as one ever does. But really, this would have been, so he would be the answer. He would be the more acceptable answer now to the most famous person I've ever met. You forget sometimes how famous they are. And this was the start of the kind of global domination, because this is the Joshua Tree set in the picture. Yeah. And it was tricky for us on Smash Hits because they were so big that we couldn't ignore them. But you can imagine they looking like they look in this picture, and the whole, they were unlikely to be bursting out of a birthday cake any day soon. And they were probably one of the few that we maybe let through, maybe because I knew them and maybe because they were so big. But we put them on the cover later in 87. And I think it is pretty much a standard Anton Corbijn shot of them rather than them doing anything. But it's a nice picture. And I think at that point we were probably at a trade-off, which was, look, it's U2. We've got, everybody loves them. Which at that point, they were one of those just massive groups. 87 was their year, the Joshua Tree and the whole explosion. So this is a moment in time. This is just about to happen for them. It's literally just about to happen.
And what about any encounters that you had with them once you joined Smash Hits?
I remember one of the few times I was allowed out of the office was for what used to be called the BPI Awards, which became the Brits, when everybody would get together, the entire industry. And Smash Hits had this fantastic idea that, which we did a number of times over the years, where because we were all going to be there, Phil Collins, Bono, and Mick Jagger, and Bros, and whoever, the only way you could get around them all would be to ask them to do something, to do the same thing. And it was agreed that I would ask them all to draw a duck. So I had a notepad with me, and they would draw it. We would sometimes do it with like their autograph, but we would get them to draw a duck, and then we would take the drawings to a graphologist, in inverted commas, who was some charlatan handwriting interpreter in Covent Garden or Soho, and we would pay them some money, and we wouldn't tell them. We'd try and sort of do it properly, and we'd say, what does this duck represent? And of course, it would be perfect because it would be Bono's. They would say, this person has a very strong personality. He wants to save the world. It's Bono, and we may have played around with it a bit, but I mean, as much as possible, it was genuine. And so I went, and I remember I sort of. Maybe it was me reading too much into it, but I got that sense of them thinking, this is what you've been reduced to. You used to be a proper journalist, interviewing us on a windswept beach in Dublin about the meaning of life, and now you're asking us to draw a frigging duck for you. I still see them, I don't see them anymore, but I would bump into them, funnily enough, over the years through connections in Ireland, and there were years where they would dominate the Q Awards, and I'd moved on to be sort of managing director of the part of the company that published Q, so I'd get to go to the awards, and they were lovely. I'd always, if I met them now, we'd have a hug and a chat. But yeah, I think they felt the duck was a bridge too far.
Well, you two were actually on the front of the last edition that we were looking at, so the one from the end of '87, and
wow.
We were discussing the band. But what we didn't discuss was the nicknames that they had in the pages of Smash It. So I don't know if you recall those, Barry.
I know that. So Adam Clearoff Clayton goes back to the duck incident because he didn't actually tell me to clear off. He said something much worse than that, but we had to dilute it down to clear off. That was when I'd asked him to draw the duck that night. And I think we had Bobo, the Hedge, Adam Clearoff Clayton, and the other one. Who, of course, Larry became a bit of a pin-up. I mean, Larry went from being the kind of young guy with a terrible haircut and suddenly blossomed into this, rather sexy, icon with the hair swept back and all the kind of biker look. It's incredible to have watched them. They literally have gone from being the kind of the band in the student union bar to this, behemoth. It was fascinating to watch that relatively close up over 40 years.
So let's move on to the letters page.
There's quite an angry letter from a young man called Simon.
It wasn't me.
And it wasn't you, no, another Simon, who is complaining about a recent feature about heavy metal, which he read in his little brother's mag. And he's absolutely furious, this lad. He really is.
Fantastic.
He says, I don't know what makes you think that the wimpy, washed-out rock peddled by pufters like Europe and Bon Jovi is HM, but you're very, very wrong. And he's talking about the true metal greats like DC and Hawkwind and Metallica. He says that the rest of the article was okay, but I wish you treated Hawkwind with a bit more respect. I mean, to be honest, if in 1987 you're reading Smash Hits and wanting Hawkwind to get a very positive write-up, you may be looking in the wrong place, But he's also talking about the thrash and death metal bands that should be featured, like Agent Steel, Halloween, Possessed, Megadeth. I mean, Barry, did you consider putting any of those on the front cover after Mission?
Thank you. I mean, to go back to, I suppose, to the basics, again, the truth is that if those bands had had hits, they would have been in Smash Hits. hence the name. The heavy metal, hard rock end of it was always a bit tricky to deal with, but if it was Iron Maiden or Def Leppard, I suppose would be the ones that I remember. I mean, if they, or maybe AC/DC, if they were in the charts or were touring, the magazine had got to such a scale that there would invariably be some people buying the magazine who would like those bands, as RSVP showed. It wasn't all just the hardcore would be Bros, Kylie, Rick Astley, Jason, but you did have when you're being read by so many people. I mean, at one point, I think it was estimated it was being read by sort of 1 in 2 teenagers in the country. You were obviously sweeping up goths and heavy metal and and some of those bands would cross over. The Cure, really interesting, or Joy Division / New Order, who were both Enemy and smash hits, just because they became so popular. And the magazine was so popular.
You just named the cover stars of the following 2 editions of the mag, John Bon Jovi and Robert Smith. There you go.
Robert Smith, we loved him because he was a proper pop star, and he played the game, as Hepworth talked about. He was happy to be in the Melody Maker and the NME, but he was equally happy to be in the cover of Smash Hits. And you do have to this day a generation who are more on the goth alternative indie side who loved smash hits, partly because we would put those people in because they were popular. Now, Hawkwind and the bands he mentions here, Agent Steel, Celtic Frost and Hellion, they're not going to be in smash hits any day of the week because nobody but this guy had heard of them. But it was very much your popularity rather than your style.
Yeah, he seems to be confusing smash hits with Kerrang.
Another later EMAP publication in later years.
Yeah. It was the letter after this one that I quite liked. Dear Mr. Typeful, did you know that there were 4 navels in the February 25th edition of Smash Hits? Love from A Perv.
You see, this is probably the period when Tom Hibbert is starting to take control of the letters page.
Yeah.
And black type and getting tea towels made and just living in this parallel universe, which was just a very strange place. And of course, because the letters page is important, but to some extent, again, you would leave that to the person who wanted to do it, because it's a bit like the singles reviews. You would have thousands of letters and you would have to, pick the 6 or 7, and then you had to get them responded to. And, it was all very analog and handcrafted. There was no easy way of doing this. And if Hibbs wanted to go slightly mad and esoteric with the letters page, you would let him, rather than have to do the letters page yourself. I know that sounds a terrible reason, but quite often it's the truth.
Do you still have a black type tea towel, Barry?
I do have a black type tea towel, and in fact, somebody recently got in touch with me that they were selling them. I try to remember, it was an aid of something, and they were selling them on the internet for quite a lot of money. You talked a bit about badges before, the whole sort of what you would now call Smash Hits merchandising. A, it wouldn't have been called that, and B, it was done in a very ramshackle, editorially led way, became hugely successful. And I remember we had this argument we had with the publishers. So we devised a badge around this time, and the badge said, "Pin it on, take it off, hours of fun guaranteed." And having this stand-up row with the publisher and the marketing director, with them saying, "But you can't just say that. It's got to promote something." And we'd say, "No, it says Smash Hits, pin it on, take it off, hours of fun guaranteed." And of course, it became one of the biggest selling, longest lasting badges we've ever done. And I think if it was today, we'd probably make a fortune out of this merchandising, which at the time, of course, you just tended to give away as a bit of an afterthought.
Put the kettle on Mother, I'm parched.
I'm parched, yeah. But exactly.
That was my particular favourite.
I mean, and again, you would never have talked about the brand then, and you would never have dreamt that we'd be sitting here talking about this 37 years later, but I suppose also there was so much money being made out of the meat and drink, the magazine, that you almost didn't have to worry about what would now be called ancillary revenue streams or something like that.
Do we want to talk about Genesis? What do they represent to us?
The only thing I would say on that is it's two things we talked about earlier. One is people might be surprised that Genesis are in there because Genesis are not a very... But again, it's like Genesis will have had a record coming out, which is probably featured at some point in this issue or a feature issue. Genesis were a popular group. The magazine would have been big enough that they would have some people reading it who would be into Genesis. So they would be, they wouldn't be top of the list, but they'd be on it. And also, at some point, I will have got a phone call from Genesis's record company saying, can you send somebody to Miami, for 3 days to do Genesis? And they'll have said, can we have them on the cover? And I'll have said, no, you can't put them on the cover of Smash Hits, but we can give you 2 pages, is it, at the back.
Yeah.
And the world being as it was, then I'll have said, okay. And I'll have rung Chris Heath and said, can you get to Miami tomorrow? I mean, it just seems absurd. And he will have said, yeah, okay. And he and a photographer probably will have been flown to Miami, paid for by the record company, stay in a very nice hotel for a few nights, interview the band and come home. This is how it used to be. And quite a lot of the time, I mean, I felt like a travel agent. I'd be in the office pretty much, 10 o'clock till 7, 8 p.m. every day, whilst the freelancers and the writers be jetting around the world, hanging out with pop stars in exotic locations. That's how it felt.
But this kind of ties back to something that we were talking about in the last edition of the podcast, where you two were on the cover. There was a feature on Sting in there, and a few other artists that within a few months, or certainly within a year of the era that we're talking about now, you probably wouldn't see in Smash Hits, and that they would be considered a Q band. So do you ever recall there being a kind of division of this artist is a Q artist and this one is a Smash Hits artist? Was there ever a conversation that you were aware of that something like that happened?
No, I mean, there would never have been a company edict, saying, here's a list of Q bands. Here's a list of Smash Hits bands. I think a number of things probably happened. I think Smash Hits was at its most successful when it was at its broadest. And I think that period lasted from 1980 to 1990. Let's say, it had the territory to itself, and it was governed by an unwritten rule that everybody gets into this if they're big enough and prepared to play the game. I think maybe subtly the emergence of Q and its rise and its success, maybe Smash Hits' natural territory a bit narrower, or it maybe made the people who were then running Smash Hits think that they had to be a bit narrower. But there was never any thing that, we've got to give U2 to Q this month. That would never have played. And in fact, some of the most intense competition internally was between Smash Hits and Q and Just 17. You'd almost rather... You used to go to the PPA Awards, which would be the equivalent of the Oscars for the magazine industry, and you'd much rather lose to Garden Answers than lose to Just 17. Because the Just 17 people were on the floor below and you had to look at them for the next year with their trophy, But Q then led to Empire, and I think Smash Hits which led to Mojo, which led to FHM, and Smash Hits gradually, over a period of time, and everybody says this, everyone who's been editor said, oh, well, it's interesting, it started to go downhill the day after I left. And it's not entirely true, but I think in general, it probably had a golden period in the 80s. And in the 90s, it still had its moments because enough bands were coming along. And the method of consumption was still broadly the same. it was only, I think, really when the world started to change around it, and to some extent the magazine maybe had run its course, that it became unsustainable. And it closed at the right time, It wasn't... It would be terrible if it was still here, I think, kind of struggling on, selling 10,000 copies.
Disgrace itself like Uncle Disgusting. Yeah.
Yes, I think it did the right thing. It had 27 years, 28 years, which is incredible, really, If a TV show lasts for 28 years, they make special documentaries about it. This is a 28-year run for the vast majority of that time, incredible success. I don't know how we get on to that, but anyway.
No. It's absolutely... well, we were talking about Q, and it just kind of, unfolded from there. That's absolutely fine. No, like I say, we just felt like, looking back at it and looking at the covers and looking at the covers of Q from the same time, there just seems to be this split that occurs at the end of 87, whereby you have U2 as being the last rock band or band of that type that appear on the cover of the 80s. And that they may still appear in the magazine, but certainly as cover stars go, I'm looking at them here. After that, we get Philip Schofield, Wet, Wet, Wet.
The Wets.
Madonna, Aha, Tiffany, Bros, and then somebody's ripped the page out of the book. So I can't see what's after that.
I think that was probably more... No, I think that was more what was happening. What was happening in the pop world. So we, at this period of Wayne Hussey in the cover, we're about to... We don't know it, but we're about to have this explosion of Stockache Waterman, Bros, Rick Astley, Jason, Donovan, Kylie Minogue, and the magazine was ready for it. It had taken a while to find its feet when I came along, and probably by the end of 87, it's like we're ready now for the next big thing, and suddenly they came from nowhere, particularly Bros, and particularly Rick Astley. And I remember, us having that sense of, okay, we're going to ride this for all it's worth, right from start through to finish. I think it was more that rather than any conscious decision to kind of drop the rock acts. And then going into the early 90s, you then had, the whole Manchester scene and clubbing and Nena Cherry being in the cover, and it just became a narrower terrain. I also think magazines develop self-imposed rules about themselves, after a period of success. Well, this is what works. And it's very hard actually to say, what works is breadth rather than justice,
Let's look at the singles reviews, shall we? So David Hepworth described it as being an absolute chore. So was this ever anything that you did yourself, Barry, or was it always delegated to someone else?
I did do it, actually. I did do it, although not that often, because, I say, a bit like Why Did I Never Go to Hawaii with Cyndi Lauper? Well, because I'd have to spend 3 days at the typesetters and the colour house and the printers down in Caerphilly or wherever it was. So you would be pushed for time. I spent most of my time as editor managing the team, being in meetings with, management, talking to record companies, doing the flat plan, trying to physically get the ads in and lay out all the stuff you have to do when you're editing a magazine at this moment in time. The idea of then taking on the singles on top would have just felt like a bridge too far, I think. So I did do it a couple of times, but most of the time you would farm it out to a freelancer, a bit like Bits. You would use it to try out a few people that you had your eye on. Roe Newton would have fallen into that category. I think, if I remember, Roe was based in Manchester and was potentially a kind of northern stringer. So that's you can see the careers of people in smash hits. Quite often they'll start on the singles, even though actually, as Hepworth was saying, it is one of the harder things to do because you have to cover about 20 different acts. It's interesting she's picked U2 as a single of the fortnight, and it was such a kind of iconic song.
Yeah,
this single will send tingles down your spine. Yeah,
there's still a lot of big hitters in this list.
It's a hell of a fortnight. Bon Jovi, Brad Adams, Blow Monkey, Susie and the Banshees, Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. Wow, yeah, Madonna,
Owen Paul,
Bangles, yeah. Oh, all the greats,
all the greats.
I tried to track that song down. That's it's very unusual in these days of the internet not to be able to find a song either on a streaming service or on YouTube. But Bring Me Back That Spark by Owen Paul Couldn't find it anywhere.
No.
I really want to hear it as well because it sounds like quite a bizarre kind of song.
She says it's
in a funny
interesting kind of way. Damning with faint praise, I suspect, from Roe Newton.
But no idea what it sounds like, that one.
No, well, probably sounded just like his hit, but with different words or something like that. I mean, Owen Paul's so memorable that I've got a compilation CD somewhere of like the hits of '86 or something like that, and they call him Paul Owen on there.
One interesting piece of minutiae is Hollywood Beyond.
Yeah.
Or their singles reviewed here. And Hollywood Beyond had been on the cover of Smash Hits just very shortly before I joined. And I there was a sort of part of the mythology was that was one of the reasons why the previous editor was no longer there. I think there was a feeling, I think he'd left of his own volition, but there was a feeling that the magazine was going down too obscure or cool a route with people like Hollywood Beyond. And the type of cover that I don't know, it was always presented rather unfairly, I'm sure, as here's why we need regime change. And I just sort of look at it and think, I don't really understand that, but okay, part of the history. The interesting choice, I think, and probably the controversial choice, is that she didn't make Madonna single of the fortnight. So to choose U2 over Madonna is quite a statement. Give a young Irishman a chance.
And then on the opposite page, a feature or a column called Thing.
I see that.
A review fashion special. It's the new sensation that's sweeping the nation, except it probably isn't. Gavin, do you want to talk us through this one?
I remember this at the time, yeah. I bought this issue. It was probably getting towards the end of when I was buying Smash Hits regularly still. I was starting to kind of outgrow it a bit, and but I remember this and thinking this looks great idea, like walking around with an album sleeve on your head, or if you've got gatefolds, you can wear them as trousers. And I remember trying it, only in the comfort of my bedroom. I didn't go out and about, and then just thinking no, because when it rains, you're just going to get your album cover wet, and you're going to look like an idiot. But I mean, Barry, was this an actual thing in America, or was this just made up for the magazine?
Do you know, I'm just looking at this, and I do not remember this. I suspect, let me just think, I think this might have been a little bit made up. I don't remember anybody ever doing it. And it's a very kind of Smash Hitsy thing to do. And also I'm noticing it's not credited to anyone, which makes me think it might have been a sort of bits type joke.
Yeah,
we may have. Sometimes in magazines, sometimes in magazines it's just purely practicalities. It may be an ad was meant to be there that has dropped out. Quite often would happen and say, "What have we got?" Last minute, we're at the printers, and that has got this kind of feel to it. I cannot believe that these people. I'm also just thinking of the date. Is it an April Fool, possibly?
Oh, of course. Possibly, yes, I never thought of that. I never thought of that. I bet that's it.
Good point. Is there anybody there in the photos then that you recognise, a member of staff or anything like that?
That's the weirdest thing. They've actually got these pictures, and the photos are credited to Julian Barton. I was just looking to see if they credited the words to April. Anybody? I don't know. I think this is probably made up, but how would we ever know? Unless the person who writes it is listening and gets in touch. But I just can't believe this. It wouldn't have been that hard to see. It would not have been that hard to go out to Carnaby Street, and that looks like Carnaby Street, and just stop a load of people back then and say, "Hey, would you put this in your head for Smash Hits?" They've probably been quite happy.
I like Mike, who's the second person who's photographed wearing a couple of gatefold sleeves as trousers, so you don't see his face. You want me to try gatefold sleeves as trousers? Yeah. Tries on a pair of the Anti-Heroin Project and the Damned Anything trousers. Great, nice and roomy. A bit flary, though. I think the Damned should be on the other leg. Can I take them off now? They're not much good for walking in. You can't bend your knees.
Mad, isn't it?
I really like Bent, the Belgian tourist in the bottom left corner, who says he's wearing a Damned album as well. He says, "Yes, it's very sexy, isn't it? Of course, we do it all the time in Belgium. Yes, I like the idea very much. I think it's very fashionable. It's much better than compact discs."
It's a classic. It's a classic example as well of a magazine starting to have the confidence to do this kind of thing. Because you've got to be quite confident that it's so off the beaten track that you've got a certain amount of confidence that the readership will tolerate it, and that the publishers are going to not sort of hold an inquiry into, is this really happening? It just looks like a bit of fun. Well done.
That was great. I like that very much.
The last record sleeve that's been tried on is by Sarah. I want the Mission. Can I try it on? Oh, it's the 12-inch. I must say, I think I'd prefer the album cover if I was going to wear it. Do I like the Mission? They're brilliant. So
that's probably me just trying to desperately justify the cover choice. I've made that one up.
Another tick for the Mission there.
If all else fails.
Yeah. And then a review of Benny King in concert, film review, Little Shop of Horrors. And then in the albums, oh, look, Barry, there's a couple of albums that you reviewed there, Atlantic Star and The Icicle Works.
Oh, my God.
You very generously gave Atlantic Star 8 out of 10. The Icicle Works 7 out of 10.
I mean, it's interesting, just before that as well.
Oh, yeah.
Just a classic, again, the assumption being at Smash, it's operated in this narrow field, and actually the live reviews are Deep Purple and Benny King. I mean, it's not what you remember. It's not even what I remember. I wouldn't have known that. I was the editor. On the album... 8 out of 10 for Atlantic Star. I don't know who Atlantic Star were, and I don't remember that album. The Icicle Works was probably, again, a slight hangover from the Melody Maker in that I would have known Ian McNabb and done stuff with the Icicle Works, and I was quite friendly with Pete Wiley and the whole Echo and the Bunnymen Crucial 3 thing, and I'm probably taking a little bit of that generosity with me into Smash Hits, because on the one level, who cares? Nobody's going to care about the album review of the Icicle Works, so I may as well give it 7 rather than give it 4. So this is maybe me being a little bit like, oh, well, okay, I'll put one in here for the old crew, rather than, do I listen to this album to this day? Probably not.
I think what's interesting here about the Icicle Works review and the review before it that William Shaw does of Erasure's The Circus is the Erasure one starts with the same phrase that your one ends with, Barry, shimmering shards. Can we just talk a little bit about the genesis of that phrase, the shimmering shards?
That was one of these... There was this whole sort of lexicon that you almost had to learn when you got in to the magazine, when you joined the staff. And shimmering shards was... shimmering shards was it was sort of what the Edge from U2 would play, that kind of weird Edge-like sound, and it would just become known as shimmering shards. So therefore, you would be sitting in the office and the U2 would come on, or anybody that sort of sounded vaguely like them, which of course a lot of people did, and somebody would say, shimmering shards, ahoy. And of course, I've either put this into the Icicle Works to try to show that I'm in on the joke, or it's probably been added by the sub-editor as a little kind of private joke at my expense. But yeah, it was that sound of Big Country, U2, The Alarm, that kind of weird guitar. You don't hear it anymore.
Sort of Celtic rock.
Yes, even U2 stopped doing it. And it was just become known as Shimmering Shards. And if you said to any of the Smash Hits team to this day, Shimmering Shards, I would know exactly what you mean. But I haven't thought of it for a long time. It's hilarious.
Well, I think that brings us pretty much to the end of the magazine, apart from mutterings.
Mutterings.
How did it get put together? I mean, I know it's kind of the gossip column, but who was responsible for gathering it together and what kind of process was involved?
There were two things. One, there was always a Kipper Williams cartoon. So Kipper Williams, if you see the cartoon, was the regular Smash Hits person. I think he was a friend of Tom Hibbert's, if I remember rightly, and Mark Ellen had sort of been brought in, and I inherited him, and he's become quite a well-known cartoonist. He does stuff for the Evening Standard and people. And then some of this would have been done by Tom Hibbert again, because Tom was brilliant at black type, mutterings, the trail for the next week. or you may have given it again to one of the newer breed. So there was no set way of doing it, as I remember. You would quite often, because it was so stylized and so uniquely smash hits, you could almost do this as a test. If you were recruiting two people, if you were recruiting a writer from the final two and you wanted to check, you'd give them, say, okay, have a go at Mutterings. So that it would be a kind of revolving feat, which brings me to my final story, if you'd like to hear it. Just towards the end of 1987, we needed to hire a new writer. And we got down to the last two, and it was Mike Sutar, who has gone on to have an amazing career and won the Industry Hall of Fame award for setting up Stylist and Shortlist magazine and doing other things. And it was down to Mike Sutar, who at the time was working at the Virgin press office, and a guy from up north, I think from Darlington, called Jim Moyer. And I gave... These are the two applicants, the two finalists, and I gave the job to Mike. And apparently I said to Mike at the time, I gave you the job because you were funnier than the other guy. And of course, Mike goes on to become Mike Sutar, and Jim Moyer 2 years later changes his name to Vic Reeves. So the legend becomes that I have appointed Mike Sutar ahead of Vic Reeves because Mike is funnier. And of course, my only defence is he wasn't Vic Reeves at the time. He was just a guy from called Jim Moore. But it is assumed such urban myth status that I was actually at a charity pop quiz with hundreds of people at it, raising money for Gavin Reid, who tragically died a few years ago, former art director of Smash Hits. And Richard Bacon was the host. I mean, we were at the Hippodrome in London, hundreds of people. And the question in round 4 is, which northern comedian was turned down for a job at Smash Hits? I'm sitting in the audience, desperately trying to say to people, he wasn't Vic Reeves at the time. And of course, people are putting answers in, Peter Kay, and it's like, how did this become? Because the subtext is, who's the clown in charge that turned him down? Moi. And it gives Mike and I great amusement to this day to think that I hired him ahead of Vic Reeves. But also, I suppose, indicative, I always remember hearing that the NME, the famous gunslinger ad that went into the NME in the late 70s, out of which they hired Tony Parsons and Julie Burchill. The 5 applicants for that were Tony Parsons, Julie Burchill, Paul Morley, Nick Hornby, and Sebastian Faulks. An incredible kind of, that's the 5 people who want the job in the NME. And to get to a point, in 1987, where the 2 applicants are Vic Reeves and a guy who would go on to, do great things in our industry, I suppose shows you what a wonderful time it was.
Absolutely, yeah. That's amazing. I didn't know that story. That's good.
Yeah, it's and I remember him, And I don't remember I don't remember thinking, it became Vic Reeves until a few years later when it started to be used as an internal EMAP pop quiz question.
So Barry, now we've gone through the whole episode in quite a bit of depth. Do you feel, at least partially, you've purged yourself of the regret and bad memories?
I do, actually. I mean, I whenever I do these talks, I always show 2 covers as a way of not to do it. One is Wayne Hussey, and the other is Robert Downey Jr. on the cover, the launch cover of a magazine called Neon, which was a sort of alternative to Empire that we did. The people who did Empire did Neon in the mid-90s, and it was a terrible cover in all the traditional senses. It's black and white. You don't actually know it's Robert Downey Jr. because it's such a strange picture of him, and the cover line is wasted. But it has gone on to become, a sort of collector's item, partly because it was the first issue of Neon, partly because it's, on one level, an amazing cover. And I suppose what I've learned from it all is you can do these things which at the time seem disastrous and commercially don't work, but you do learn a lot from them, and in some cases they go on to become collector's items that people, because they're not the norm. And I suppose looking back now, 33 years later, isn't it fantastic that there was once a time, children, when we put Wayne Hussey from The Mission on the cover of the biggest selling pop magazine in the world and got away with it and survived. And of course, it was the prelude to the greatest success the magazine ever had over the next 2 to 3 years.
So who was on the cover of the biggest selling issue? Do you remember?
Yes, I do, and it's another pop quiz answer that people never get right because they always think it's Bros or Jason and Kylie. It's actually Yaz for The Only Way Is Up. The story behind it briefly is it's because it was the first televised Smash Hits Awards poll winners issue. So Smash Hits had started to poll winners, and we went on TV in, I think, 89, maybe 88, but 89 was the kind of apogee, the crowning, the big, it was on mainstream television. And the following Wednesday or whatever, the magazine came out. She had been the closing act on the poll winners concert with The Only Way Is Up. It was number one. It sold a huge amount of copies, and the sort of combination of all of those factors, particularly the TV exposure, put it over the million. I think it was the only issue that went over a million. It did like 1,020,000. And obviously it was just before I left, so it was a fantastic parting shot. And, you know, a couple of weeks later, Tom Maloney, who I mentioned earlier, took me out for a drink. And he said, we're launching a film version of Q, and we want you to be the editor. And I said, I know nothing about films. In fact, I can't even say the word properly. Films. I know nothing about films. And he said, that's why you'd be perfect for the job. And the rest is history and another podcast, I suspect.
Yeah. I'm just looking, actually, the Yaz cover would have been about October, November 88.
Okay. I think we might have had one or two after that on the back of that sold over 1 million, but it's to my understanding, and I think I could have statistical evidence from the Audit Bureau of Circulation to back this up, and that is the biggest selling issue of Smash Hits of all time. And obviously I'm very proud to have been the custodian of the brand at that point before heading off to the world of Hollywood when things got even stranger. ...
Yeah, so looking back at that period, who was your own particular favourite Smash Hits pop star?
I think probably either Bros or Rick Astley. Bros were just huge for a very brief period of time, but they were sort of perfect for Smash Hits. You know, they came from nowhere. They looked really good. They had those, do you remember the kind of Grolsch bottle tops on their boots?
Yeah.
You know, they combined a number of different things, kind of style, and, you know, they looked fantastic, and they were ready to do anything you wanted them to do, you know. And I remember, you know, going over to New York, because I was allowed out at one point to go and meet the publishing team behind Star Hits, which was the American version of Smash Hits. And Bros were there, and we went out to a club with them, and it sort of seems crazy looking back on that. But Rick Astley was probably the one where I felt the magazine was most set up and ready for somebody to come along, and it happened to be him. And yeah, he was perfect because he was the T-boy, and he was from the north, and he had a backstory, and he was a ruddy big pig, and he was stock and Waterman, and again, you know, he was the boy next door. You know, you just think, oh God, he looks like literally the guy next door, you know. And to watch his success, which again at the time was brief, although he's kind of come back as a Bros, bizarrely, through that documentary. It was fantastic fun. Just, you know, I felt really confident at that point that we kind of knew what we were doing, and I was able to kind of go on from that and leave the magazine in very good hands.
Thank you very much, Barry. It's been really fascinating here in the
it's been great fun, actually.
Peek behind the curtain. You know,
yes,
what went into each issue, and just the amount of work and late nights and soul searching. You know, that's still going on 33 years later.
I know,
but you know that's absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you guys.
Really good,
terrific what you're doing. Thank you.
And I'd also just like to say thank you very much to Mark, the lad from the RSVP, and for getting back in touch with me and answering my questions about pen pals and, you know, all things Human League. So thank you, Mark. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Barry. And of course, thanks to you for listening. Come and say hello to us at Giddy Pop Pod on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, and also our website, giddypoppod.home.blog, where you'll also find the links to the edition of Smash Hits that we've been looking at, along with those Spotify and YouTube playlists for that extra layer of experience. And we hope you can join us next time on the Giddy Carousel of Pop.